Hezekiah was one of Israel's greatest kings, certainly among the top three of their most successful and effective kings. Also one of the godliest kings of the nation of Israel. The greatest crisis that he experienced during his time as king was when the Assyrian armies were invading the surrounding territories. They had conquered pretty much everyone around, and they came to lay siege to Jerusalem. They were an overwhelming force compared to the armies of Jerusalem. And in this moment, we see perhaps the best example of Hezekiah's amazing leadership in the midst of a crisis situation. So I want to look briefly at how Hezekiah led his people in the midst of a crisis. And we're going to see four things that he did which were instrumental in the deliverance that they ultimately experienced from God. The story is told in 2 Chronicles 32. It's also told in 2 Kings, but we're going to be working from the 2 Chronicles chapter 32 version. We see the context in the opening verse. After these deeds of faithfulness, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered Judah. He camped against the fortified cities, thinking to win them over to himself. And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come, and that his purpose was to make war against Jerusalem, here we find the first of four things that Hezekiah does. It says he consulted with his leaders and commanders. The key word here, he consulted. If we look at it in another translation, the same Hebrew word is translated, he planned. In other words, he didn't go it alone, he didn't give up. He got the best people he could around him, and they came up with a plan. So we see, what did Hezekiah do? Well, firstly, he consulted. That is, he came up with a plan or a strategy to face the crisis that was pending. He could have been defeatist here, but he wasn't defeatist. He got the best people he could around him, and they came up with the best strategy they could to defend the city, to defend their people. We'll see in a moment that he also exemplifies great faith in the midst of the crisis. And I think it's interesting from this point of view that planning is not the opposite of faith. Planning is faith at work. We plan as best we can, and then we pray fervently for God to do the rest. The second thing that we see Hezekiah doing comes in verse 5. It says, in the New King James Version, it says, and he strengthened himself. And specifically, it means he strengthened himself in the sense that they all got to work rebuilding the dilapidated fortifications of the city of Jerusalem. They built up all the wall that was broken, raised up the towers, built another wall outside, repaired the Millo in the city of David, and made weapons and shields in abundance. So he strengthened himself. I think the ERV puts this nicely. It says, he set to work resolutely. He set to work resolutely. So the second thing he did in the midst of the crisis was that he worked. And he got the people to work passionately. And I love that word in the ESV where it says he worked resolutely. They were resolved to do everything they could, everything in their power to ward off the onslaught that was coming. Of all the qualities that I find distasteful in a human being, arguably the one I find most distasteful is laziness or slothfulness. Here we see a man facing unbelievable odds, everything stacked against him, and it would be very easy for someone in that situation to throw in the towel, to give up, to look for an escape, but he doesn't do that. He says, we are going to work with every fiber of our being. We're going to work like everything depends on us to make this city as secure as we can. We're going to do everything we can to play our part to defend our city. And so they work resolutely in the face of the crisis. The third thing he does is in verse 6. It says he set combat command. Well, let's go back to the base text I'm working from. It says, then he set military captains over the people and gathered them together to him in an open square of the city, and he gave them encouragement. He gave them encouragement, saying, be strong and courageous. Now, if those words ring a bell, they borrowed from the book of Joshua, where God says exactly the same to Joshua. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid nor dismayed before the king of Assyria, nor before all the multitude that is with him. And listen to this amazing statement that Hezekiah gives to motivate his people, to speak courage and hope and faith into them in the midst of insurmountable odds. He says, for there are more with us than with them. Now that's an amazing statement, because it was literally untrue. The Assyrian army, I presume, was an overwhelming force compared to what Jerusalem could muster to defend itself. And yet he says there are more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. So Hezekiah does a third thing here. He believed. He believed there was still hope. There was a way out of this crisis, that God will not allow us to go through something from which there is no possibility of escape. And then he spoke words of faith and courage to help his people believe. One thinks of Winston Churchill during World War II and the power of his speeches that rallied a nation to be strong and courageous in the face of an evil onslaught. We see here too that working and planning are not the antithesis of believing. They planned as best they could. They worked as hard as they could, resolutely, to do everything in their power. But then they believed that deliverance still had to come from God, but that God was willing and able. And so Hezekiah speaks hope and faith into his people. Then the story is told of how Sennacherib comes and tries to undermine the resolve of the people, talking about how no other gods of the surrounding peoples they've attacked had been able to withstand him. And so when we get to the end, nearer the end of the story in verse 20, we read, now because of this King Hezekiah, because of what Sennacherib was threatening to do, King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, that's the same one who wrote the book, son of Amos, prayed and cried out to heaven. So the fourth thing he does is that he prays. He doesn't pray tritely. He doesn't pray in a formalized way. They cried out to heaven. Isn't that an amazing picture? Cried out to heaven. They prayed like everything depended on God. They worked like everything depended on what they could do, and they gave it 100% effort. But then they trusted that deliverance would come from God, and they prayed fervently and passionately as if everything depended on God, which ultimately it did. And in the midst of this particular invasion, God intervenes miraculously, and the nation is spared. They're not spared directly as a consequence of what the leaders could do. The planning and the working played a part, but what the planning and the working did was that they inspired a people to believe that God could still come through and protect and deliver them. And then they believed and trusted, and God came through miraculously in response to their crying out to heaven. I think Hezekiah gives us an amazing example of brilliant godly leadership in the midst of a crisis situation. When we face a crisis, we too should consult and make good strategic plans. We should work resolutely and do everything in our power to prepare ourselves and to ward off the danger that's coming. And then we must almost come to the end of ourselves and fling ourselves on God's mercy and say, we believe that you can come through. We encourage ourselves and our people. And then lastly, we need to pray like everything depends on God, because ultimately everything does depend on God.